In a grand hall filled with a multitude of nobles, a young boy found himself placed upon a table. Before him lay 4 distinct weapons, marking an extraordinarily special day in his young life. The weapon he chose would chart the course of his future. Under the watchful and expectant eyes of the assembled crowd, the boy slowly reached out towards the 4 items. However, what transpired next astonished everyone present. As he neared the weapons, all 4 began to glow with a brilliant light. His parents exchanged bewildered glances, but the meaning of this phenomenon quickly became clear to all. The boy was a true prodigy, a supreme genius capable of mastering any path he might choose. The boy himself understood this well, for he carried within him memories from a past life. To truly understand this moment, one had to journey back to a particular time on a battlefield. A thought echoed within him, a memory of a past self. He had once believed that someone with awakened talent would take root on the battlefield and forge a new life, a life where he could finally have the family he had always yearned for. But he had been wrong. Amid the desolate scene, a voice filled with admiration cut through the air, remarking on his tenacity and noting it had been a long time since someone had made him swing his sword more than 10 times. The speaker inquired if he was the famous Argrik, the rising talent of the battlefield. Before him stood a young warrior, Argrik, his left arm severed and his breath coming in ragged gasps from blood loss and exhaustion. Hearing the man's words, Argrik thought to himself that the man knew him, a realization that surprisingly brought him joy. With this thought, he gritted his teeth, propped himself up with his sword, looked up at his opponent, and greeted him with a wry laugh, acknowledging the honor of being recognized by Duke Thermion. Argrik belonged to the Draic Empire, and before him stood Duke Bout Thermion, who noticed the young warrior's recognition. A flicker of surprise crossed the Duke's eyes as he asked if Argrik knew his name. Argrik replied that of course he did, for who hadn't heard of him, one of the 6 hexagonal knights of the Altan Empire, whose name alone carried enough weight to feel the pressure of the Black Wave in a single day on the battlefield, a man who hailed from the alien empire. Duke Bout Thermion, upon hearing Argrik's words, felt a trace of admiration for the young warrior. He mused that even knowing who he was, Argrik still chose to face him, adding that it would be a shame to cut down such talent so early. He thoughtfully offered Argrik a rare chance at life, asking if he would surrender. The Duke waited for an answer, but Argrik merely glanced aside and shook his head. He whispered to himself that he was born on the battlefield and so he would die there as well. With those words, he lifted the sword planted in the ground and swung it with all his might, sending a violent gust of wind that shook the air and scattered objects around them, creating an empty space between the 2 combatants. Duke Thermion, watching the expression on Argrik's face, fell silent before speaking in a calm yet somber tone. He noted that even so, he could still see regret in Argrik's eyes, acknowledging that he would have been a formidable opponent with more time. Still, since this was his choice, Thermion hoped that in his next life, he would let go of his regrets. As he spoke, Thermion's sword began to glow with a powerful aura, and he charged straight at the young warrior. Their blades clashed a final time, and in just a few swift strikes, the battle reached its inevitable conclusion and Argrik was killed. The scene shifts to a woman holding a baby in her hands. His mother had been a young war widow, a refugee who had left him behind in the chaotic world before her last breath. Everyone knew the fate that awaited an orphan child. Argrik had wandered the blood-soaked fields of war, surviving in solitude, doing whatever it took to stay alive. At 14, he was sent to his first battlefield. It was there that his talent awakened, and the mana core in his heart elevated his movements and senses beyond anything he had ever known. One day, a superior officer had told him that he intended to recommend him for the upcoming special knight appointment, assuring him that with his talents, joining the ranks of the hexagonal knights was within his grasp. The words had made Argrik smile faintly. After breaking through to a 4th-tier corps, he had finally earned the chance he had longed for. He thought that after this battle, he would finally find peace and have everything he had ever wanted. But fate had other plans. Duke Thermion appeared, and with a single stroke of his blade, shattered Argrik's sword into pieces. One devastating strike, and his weapon pierced Argrik's chest. What a shame, Argrik thought bitterly as he felt the life drain from him. He had wanted to rise higher, he had wanted a family. His body was flung backward like a cannonball, and just like that, his dreams crumbled into dust. He thought that was the end. Darkness swallowed his vision completely, until suddenly, a warm, gentle voice broke through the void, announcing that their little Dane was awake. A woman's melodic laughter filled his ears, remarking on what a sweet boy he was for not crying at all, and admiring his bright and beautiful eyes, declaring him a true gift from the heavens. A beautiful woman with golden hair tenderly touched a tiny hand before her, her voice overflowing with love. Meanwhile, the man beside the woman wore a similar expression, happily stating that this boy truly was a great gift from the gods. It was only at that moment that Argrick, now Dan, finally became aware of his situation. He was a child and he couldn't understand what they were talking about. His face contorted with utter bewilderment as he flailed his tiny arms wildly in confusion. Sensing the baby's distress, the man gently picked him up with a warm smile and spoke to him softly, saying that Argrick would grow up to be a great spearman like his father, Arkin. But just as these words left his mouth, Lady Lily Sogres immediately snatched baby Dane from his arms and retorted that it was nonsense. Dan would become an amazing assassin. Arkin's face twitched with discomfort as he called his wife sweetheart and questioned how she could make their youngest son an assassin, calling it terrible and asserting that a real man wielded a spear, the most beautiful and perfect form of martial art, his eyes sparkling with delusions of grandeur. Lily firmly retorted that being an assassin was far better than being a spearman, explaining that he could hide in the shadows, striking down his enemies without ever being noticed, arguing that it was far cooler. So there he was, done through, reflecting on his strange fate. He had thought it was over, but he had been reborn, and not only that, he had been reincarnated into the alien empire, his enemy, as the youngest son of a count. And now his new parents were locked in a heated debate over his future, seemingly even more determined to shape him into their successor since he was born late. Back with the young couple after a fruitless round of bickering, Arkin sighed in defeat and offered a compromise, agreeing that they would teach him both. Of course, Dane would become an assassin, Lily declared with a triumphant grin, while Arkin coaxed that Dane would become a spearman, the best there ever was, his voice full of enthusiasm. Lily firmly reminded him that he would be an assassin as they continued their playful banter. The coachman at the front of the carriage turned back to announce that they had arrived. Arkin blinked in surprise, remarking on how quickly time passed. He turned to his wife, asking her to take his hand. Lily whispered, blushing, wondering what if someone from the city saw them. Arkin replied, his tone teasing yet tender, that it didn't matter, he simply wanted to hold his wife's hand, there was nothing wrong with that. All right, she muttered, but told him to be careful as Arkin offered his hand gallantly. He helped her step down from the carriage, prompting baby Dane, snuggled in Lily's arms to witness their romantic exchange up close. What a sickening display, Dane grumbled internally, adding that it was enough to hurt his eyes. Yet, as his gaze wandered, taking in the sights around him, his eyes sparkled with growing excitement. Arkin agreed, noting how happy their little Dane seemed to be home. Yes, Dane thought with a grin, if this was his home, then it would be the perfect place for his talents to Sogres, and with that, his heart brimmed with anticipation, ready for a fresh beginning. 2 months quickly passed, and by now, young Dane had started to babble a few words, filling Lady Lily with immense joy. She exclaimed that Dane was already babbling, and in response to her words, the protagonist's mouth kept moving nonstop, making sounds like a rapid-fire popping noise. For him, this was quite a new experience. He mused that this was what it felt like to babble, a completely new sensation. After all, during his time wandering on the battlefield, he had very little interaction with children. The few children he had met were injured, bandaged up, and crying with no place to go. Many of them cried for their lost parents, eventually succumbing to hunger and vanishing. Compared to that, the Sogres' household was a rich and fortunate place, one where he wouldn't starve to death. Dane happily thought that he had been reincarnated into an easy mode, not some hellish existence. At that moment, his father, Count Sogres, barged in, laughing loudly and showing Dane a spear, asking what he thought of it, describing it as long and beautiful. The enthusiastic man seemed eager to instill the idea of being a spearman into Dane's mind while he was still young. In response, Dane could only give a faint, awkward smile. He thought that this man was his father, Arkin Sogres, the strongest level 6 spearman in the kingdom, and though he looked so gentle, he was a heroic warrior known as the Green Storm. Meanwhile, Lady Lily, seeing her husband proudly flaunting a weapon in front of their baby son, became quite irritated. She grabbed the spear from him and questioned how he could bring such a sharp object into their son's room. In response, Arkin's demeanor became much more subdued as he defensively stated that he had just wanted to show it to Dan. Lily retorted that she had told him before not to do this, warning that if he kept acting like this, she would start teaching him basic stealth techniques from an early age. Lady Lily replied coldly, which made Arkin break out in a cold sweat, as Lily had been the kingdom's best assassin before, so it was clear she meant business. Although Arkan was slightly afraid of his wife, he still managed to muster up some resistance, arguing that nowadays everyone did this, even the famous magical families placed a staff next to their babies when they were born, questioning the difference. He insisted that his spear was sharp. Lily snapped back that a spear compared to a staff was far sharper. Watching the scene unfold, their son Dane could only sigh like an old man in a young body, thinking what a harmonious family they were. At this point, Dane became aware of the reason why both of his parents were so concerned about his future. Both of his older sisters had chosen paths that were completely unrelated to spear fighting or assassination. Time passed quickly, and now Dane was visited by his two older sisters. The little girl in a red dress told Dane that if he kept doing that, his cheeks were going to puff up, and then she did something that caused his cheeks to puff out. After she finished, she couldn't hide her excitement, exclaiming how cute Dane was and marveling at his cheeks. Dane thought, screaming internally, his fists clenched in frustration but unable to do anything. Looking at his older sister in the red dress, Dane quickly recalled her identity. Thanks to her magical talent, Arabella had followed the path of magic from an early age. By the age of 12, she had already reached level 3 of a mage, and given that the highest rank for a mage was level 9, Arabella was a genius for surpassing the basic level at such a young age. As Dane remembered this, Arabella placed her hand on his cheek and teased him, asking if he wanted to learn magic with her when he grew up, explaining that she studied alone every day and was so bored. Dane muttered inwardly not to make that face and to stop teasing him. Meanwhile, his other older sister spoke up, mentioning that summoning magic wasn't bad either. Dane turned his gaze to his sister in a blue dress, Claire Sogres. Claire was an excellent summoner, having learned summoning magic at the age of 7, and now she could control 2 summoned creatures at the same time. At first, Dane thought she didn't like him, but it seemed more like she was jealous of him. Recently, she seemed to have warmed up to him. At this moment, Claire gingerly poked his nose with her finger, then quickly withdrew her hand, giving Arabella a confused look and asking why his nose was so soft. Arabella giggled in agreement, and then Claire mischievously turned to her younger brother and said that if Dane also had a talent for summoning, it would be so much fun and she could teach him later, smiling warmly at him. Before these suggestions, Dane could only smile in his heart, thinking that everyone wanted to teach him their talents. He reflected on his family. His father was a level 6 spearman, his mother a former assassin who once attempted to assassinate the king, his eldest sister a genius mage, and his second sister also a genius summoner. The Sogres' family was truly a perfect noble family. Exactly the kind of ideal family he had imagined. He wondered what the point of revenge was in this life. Even though his death was tragic, it had been on a battlefield, and saying he would take revenge on those who defeated him was truly laughable, Dane thought in frustration. It seemed that at this moment, he had decided to give up on revenge and move on. Returning to the story very quickly, he was awakened by some arguing in front of him. Arkan shouted that he must choose the spear, while Lily reminded that stealth and assassination were more useful. At the same time, his two sisters, Arabella and Claire, also shared their opinions, stating that magic was the trend nowadays and summoning skill was also good. Seeing them discussing his future like this, Dane sat quietly on the side and couldn't help but smile lightly. He thought that he had always wanted a home and that he was so lucky to have been born here. Thinking of this, the argument started to get louder, giving him a headache. Indeed, this was a harmonious family, wasn't it? Dane asked himself. Speaking of the Sogres' family, they had a very special ritual called the Ritual of Selection. When a child in the family turned 1 year old, many objects were laid out on a table in front of them, and everyone guessed the child's future based on the object they chose. And today was the day Dane turned 1 year old. Someone remarked that today was young Master Dan's first birthday, and those around him exclaimed in surprise, noting how quickly time flew and that the young ladies had become summoners and mages. People wondered what young Master Dane would choose, saying that after the ritual, they would soon know. A certain uncle suggested with a smile that they should go inside now. Shortly after, inside the grand hall, everyone quickly gathered to wait and see what Dane would choose. At this moment, the little lord was placed on the table, and in front of him were 4 items representing different directions. From left to right, there was a spear, a yellow plate, a small pouch, and a short sword. Looking at these items, the guests around them began whispering among themselves, noting that the young ladies had also brought their items and remarking on how cute they were and how quickly they had grown up. Turning towards Lily, she whispered to Dane to just choose what he liked. Hearing his mother say this, a moment of contemplation showed in the protagonist's eyes. He sighed, wondering what he should do, feeling that surely everyone expected him to pick their items. Over here, Arkan also looked at his son and smiled as though he was certain of victory, thinking little Dane would be attracted to Longwei. Longwei was the spear made from the rare Dorkan ore. When mana was poured into it, it would become heavy and sharp, just like its owner's mana, a mystical magic spear that Arkan had used all his life. Choose your father's spear, Dane, Arkan thought to himself. Meanwhile, Lady Lily had already clasped her hands and was praying, thinking the boy was too handsome to be an assassin. But Dane would still choose the dagger. The dagger placed on the table by Lady Lily was called Black Eye, made from ethene ore. It contained all the elements in the world and could hold and combine with various poisons. Over here, his older sister Arabella also stared at her younger brother with a confident smile, thinking Dane would definitely become a great mage later and would follow her to the academy. The item she placed on the table was a small spatial pouch, an item that only mages or those with magical talents could use. Little brother, quickly choose my pouch, Arabella thought to herself. On the other side, his sister Claire seemed a bit shy, silently wishing that if Dane knew summoning magic, she would take him flying on a dragon with her, that being her dream. The item she placed in front of Lily was a summoning seal, a seal that summoners used to receive a unique emblem according to their talent and could use to call forth their summoned creatures. Returning to Dane with his own awareness, he could naturally see and feel the expectant gaze of his family upon him. And the more he looked, the more pressure he felt, to the point where he began to sweat heavily. He thought to himself, overwhelmed by the pressure, that this was such a hassle, but he couldn't avoid it and wondered what he should choose, deciding to base it on everyone's expressions. As he thought this, he slowly moved forward, deciding to leave his future in the hands of their expressions. Upon seeing him begin to move, the group also got excited. Arkan called out for Heck, saying that was right and telling Dane to choose what he wanted. But immediately Lady Lily interrupted, saying the short and sharp one was the most beautiful and that she liked that pouch the most, reminding Dane she had shown it to him. Various coaxing voices began to ring out, giving Dane quite the headache. He hadn't even made his choice yet and was already feeling the pressure. Then, as Dane approached the 4 items, for some reason all 4 items emitted a brilliant glow, causing his face to freeze for a few seconds in confusion. He wondered what was going on, and behind them, the young couple had no idea what was happening either. Lady Lily asked what was going on, and Arkan shook his head, saying he didn't know either. Meanwhile, the guests around them, witnessing this scene, grew even more excited, exclaiming that all 4 items were reacting and wondering how this could be, with someone saying it seemed like the young master was a genius in everything. At the same time, Dane was visibly delighted, thinking to himself that he was already very skilled on the battlefield, but this life really felt like a whole different level. Turning to Arabella, she looked at the situation and could only turn to ask her father what they should do, saying this had never happened before. Arkan responded, saying he could hardly believe it himself. Then the young couple exchanged looks and reached a consensus. They announced that the 4 of them would teach him together. Upon hearing this, the 2 sisters looked at their parents in confusion, questioning if all of them would teach him up front. Dane also burst into a very happy smile. That's a wrap. The story continues in my next video. Like and subscribe to stay notified.